Chapter 2 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. The Fighting Whale and a Chinaman in the Chicken Coop. The hot days drifted by in easy sociability, dividing themselves into a pliant routine. The morning was devoted to golf on the canvas-covered deck over a 9-hole course, chalked around ventilators, chicken coops, and deck houses. Crook-handled canes furnished the clubs, and 3 sets of checkers were lost overboard before we reached the Guayas River, the little round men skidding flatly over the deck with a pleasing accuracy, only at the end to rise up maliciously on one ear and roll, plop, into the sea. In the white-hot afternoon, when the scant breeze would quite as likely drift with us, the hours were sacred to the siesta, and the evenings were devoted to standardizing an international polyglot poker. A rope stretched across the afterdeck marked off the steerage. There was no second class, as a thrifty French tailor, a fine young man, and his soft-voiced Mediterranean bride found out. They had bought second class through to Lima, and at the Boca were flung in aft among the half-breeds, a squabbling lot of steerage scum, together with a gang of Chinamen. A line of piled baggage ran lengthwise, on one side of which were supposed to be the bachelors' quarters, though somewhere between decks were hutches where, if one really insisted on privacy, the tropical night could be passed in a fetid broil. Through a surreptitious connivance, this couple were allowed quarters forward, and evening after evening the little bride would bring her guitar out and play. And such playing! She had been on the stage, it seemed, and from opera to opera she drifted, and then off into odd, unheard folk songs, or the vibrant German or Russian songs. Never before or since have I heard such playing of a guitar, or felt its possibilities. For us, the guitar is an instrument lazily plunked by the end man against 2 mandolins, yet there was a time when Paganini deemed it worthy of mastery. She was playing late one afternoon, and we were all gathered around in the dining hall. There came a rush of feet overhead and a shrill, excited chattering. We broke for the deck, expecting a mutiny among the Chinamen at the very least, and there, in full view, not 500 yards away, was a battle between a whale and 3 thrasher sharks. In a great circle the sea was churned to a foam, boiling with the stroke of fin and fluke as the sharks outflanked and harried the whale. In a steady succession the sharks would shoot high out of the water in a graceful, deadly curve and, as they fell back, suddenly stiffen in a whiplash bend that instantly straightened at the moment of impact, sending a flying mass of spray like that when a solid shot ricochets in gun practice. A few such blows and even a bulky, blubber-coated whale would feel it. Sometimes a shark would strike fair, though more often he would waste his energy on the empty water as the whale dove. But the steadiness of the battering attack, sometimes all 3 sharks in the air as though by a signal, sometimes a steady procession pouring up from the sea in a wicked arc as regular as a clock's ticking, and sometimes the frantic whirling of the whale showed the submarine strategists at work, while only a single shark shot up in a well-aimed whiplash stroke. In desperation the whale would stand on its head and beat the air in terrific blows with its flukes, while the sharks would merely wait until the flurry was over, and then renew their steady, wearing, pounding battle. Off at one side of the circle of beaten foam was a little dark patch that paddled nervously about, and that we had overlooked. A whale calf. And now it was apparent why the fight was fought in the diameter of a ship's length. Always the bulk of the grim old mother was between the attack and her clumsy baby. There was the reason why she did not make a running fight of it that would have given her a more even break, for the speed of a squadron is that of its slowest ship. All the advantage lay with the sharks. It was easy to see they were wearing the whale down. Less often she stood on her head to batter the foam hopefully with her ponderous flukes. The sharks redoubled their efforts until they curved in a steady, leaping line. Along the rail of the Mapocho, the passengers, deck and cabin, cheered the battle as their tense sympathies dictated, or drew whistling breaths as some crashing whiplash went home. The deep sapphire of the sea rippling under the brisk evening breeze, the turquoise heaven that swept down to the horizon softly shifting against the sapphire, contrast to a mystery of fragile green, the field of battle boiling and eddying in the mellow orange glow of the long rays of the setting sun and bursting into masses of iridescent spray made a noble setting worthy of the cause, and in it 80 tons of mother love and devotion measuring itself in horsepower and foot tons was slowly drooping under the hail from a slim, glittering, iridescent arc. Smaller grew the fight in the distance, a mile and a half. Then 2/3 of the whale's bulk shot clear of the surface and she fell back heavily. Once more the head went down and the flukes raised themselves, lashing the air in frantic desperation. The curving, confident line of sharks shot upward in a graceful curve, but this time, overconfident, they had miscalculated. The great tail caught one shark and he hurtled through the flying spray with a broken back. The flukes crashed down on a second as he struck the water. Once only the surviving shark leaped and missed. Alone he could do no more. The whale, in one lucky stroke, had won. Through the glasses we could make out its low mass slowly swimming off, every now and then spouting a feather of spray from her blowhole, as though saluting her own victorious progress with a steam whistle. 5 days out from Panama, and we awoke to find the Mapocho swinging to her anchor in the Guayas River and awaiting the pleasure of the port doctor. On one side, a distant shore loomed through the heated, humid haze. On the other, a sluggish tidewater creek disappeared in the jungle of the bank an easy rifle-shot away. A ramshackle church with a huge crucifix showed at one side of the port doctor's house, and here and there a few houses and thatched roofs appeared above a stretch of white beach. A few black pigs wandered about, showing the only signs of life. Somewhere beyond this dismal outpost was Guayaquil. Already in the captain's quarters was a conference of the skipper, the young Chilean ship's doctor fresh from school and on his first trip, and the port doctor. Presently they emerged, the captain feebly expostulating. We were to be held under observation for 48 hours as yellow fever and bubonic suspects. That Guayaquil should quarantine against anything is, at least to an ordinary sense of humor, funny, for Guayaquil has never seen the time that it was likely to catch anything it did not already have, except a clean bill of health. We learned for the first time that there were 3 Chileans aboard who were being returned to Chile by their consul. They were anemic, destitute, and sick with malarial fever. Although the whole coast was in a panic over yellow fever and the bubonic, yet this time had been chosen to ship them home some 2,000 miles to a Chilean hospital. They had been stowed between decks, and the young ship's doctor had made the mistake of attempting to gloss over their existence, or at any rate to split the difference between truth and expediency, and had succeeded only in exciting a peevish suspicion in a marooned gentleman who had some power. He did not even look at the cases. Quarantine 48 hours, and then he would return with advices from the government. A few of us went down to take a look at the Chileans whose appearance had held us up. There was no formal hospital on board, so a little compartment had been hastily thrown up between decks. It was built of the loose planks on which the cattle stand during the voyage. It was closed on all 4 sides, windowless, and with but a single opening for a doorway curtained by a filthy piece of canvas. This black hole, reeking with filth, was the hospital. A couple of figures lay on the floor and looked up dully at the sudden flare of a match, while, from an open cargo port, the third was tottering, a shrunken wreck with the ghastly teeth of a skull and socketed eyes. At noon, the purser presented each first cabin passenger with a little bill for half a sovereign, $2.50 gold, which amount we were charged for as demurrage every day in any quarantine. The deck steerage paid a shilling gold each day. The purser, a pleasant young Chilean with an Irish name, yet who spoke no word of English, was the one busy man on the idle ship. In expectation of quarantine, the occupants of the port chicken coop had been transferred, and now the purser appeared with the first officer, the boatswain, and a few of the crew. They climbed the rope, and the purser jangled a chain and padlock suggestively. One by one the shillings came out. He reached the Chinamen. Some were dragged from below or hauled out from the partition of baggage in which they had tried to hide, all protesting sullenly. Those who refused to pay were thrown into the chicken coop until about a dozen were jammed into its close quarters. It was too low for even a small man to stand upright, while its condition made it impossible to lie down, so that the Chinamen squatted on the floor or huddled up on the perches. Then, as they decided to pay, if the purser had nothing on hand more pressing, he would come up and let them out. Of those who witnessed this wretched steamship extortion, the German really enjoyed it. He clucked and mimicked before the coop with great gusto, and then scuttled below for his camera. He had scarcely focused before the free Chinamen who knew a camera were chattering shrilly in hostile groups, the caged Chinamen clacking angrily back, and the first officer pounced upon the photographic outfit. This collecting of shillings from the Chinamen and the method of enforcement is no light-hearted morning's pleasure, and is likely at any time to end seriously. Also, it could be noted that in the immediate background were others of the officers and crew following operations, and the arms rack aft of the chart room was unlocked. Much may be said in favor of the chicken coop method, for there was one time, the purser related, that another purser in collecting the shillings used the fumigating boiler of the upper deck. 8 obstinate Chinamen were shoved in and the end lid clamped on. An hour of dark dungeon would be better than the airy chicken coop, argued the astute collector, for the chicken coop has been known to prove so alluring that Chinamen had begun serving on their second day's shilling before they had paid the first, and he was pleased at the frantic scrabbling that sounded through the iron sides. Then it died down. Ah, the sullen apathy of the race. And when the end lid was taken off, the bodies of 8 dead Chinamen were taken out, suffocated. It was no end of trouble to that purser, for he had to juggle with his passenger sheet and the various port officials so that the ship wouldn't be held in quarantine and make the captain and owners peevish and thereby lose his job. Caramba! It was lucky they were Chinamen. Slowly the 48 hours on the broiling river passed away. In the morning of its close we looked anxiously to the nearer shore for the sign of official life. Except for the straggling black pigs, all was lifeless beach and jungle. The hours passed. It was noon. We breakfasted at that late Latin hour, irritably. Presently the placid captain sent a string of signals up the foremast. Still the creek, the strip of beach, and the jungle gave forth no signs of life other than the black pigs. More time passed, and the captain had the whistle blown at intervals. No result. As a desperate measure, he had the capstan turned, a bluff, for it was free of the cable, but as the dismal clank of the pawls carried to shore, 6 figures scuttled down to the creek and tumbled into the official boat. A few minutes later, it was at the companion ladder, and the port doctor was mounting haughtily. Why this uproar? The sanitary junta had been notified of our arrival. What could one more? A reply had been received this morning, or was it the day before, that the sanitary junta was very busy, but would consider the quarantine of the Mapocho at a meeting this very night. In the meantime... He spoke with a patient, restrained peevishness as to an unreasonable child. The august sanitary junta sat, augustly, at Guayaquil. From this port doctor's station to Guayaquil was some distance. To telegraph, one made one's report, then it was paddled across the muddy Tidewater Creek in a dugout, then it was carried on foot across the island, for this strip of beach and home of the straggling black pigs was but a portion of an island of some size, and then across more water in a dugout, and there was a telegraph station. Naturally, all this took time. The port boat put back and the captain returned to his quarters. From the stern again came the sickening pop of firecrackers where the Chilean crew resumed their fishing, hauling in a slender, stupid variety of catfish, and then tossing it back with a well-timed firecracker thrust in its gaping throat. We watched the shabby boat run on the beach and the port doctor disappear in the jungle path. The crew gathered up the oars when suddenly the doctor darted back. The crew tumbled into the boat, and in a flurry of ragged rowing they came splashing toward us. Hope revived, a release from the august sanitary junta. A biscuit toss off, they stopped. The doctor rose in the stern sheets and grandly ordered us out of Ecuadorian waters. If we did not leave at once, we would be fired upon. By what there was no intimation. It might have been a black pig from a bamboo catapult, for there was nothing else in the way of artillery. But it sounded formal and terrible, so we left. And with us went 5,000 packages of freight and 90 sacks of mail intended for Guayaquil and the furious Ecuadorian passengers. The Peruvians were complacent. "It is better for us," they said, "than to have to put into that wretched Guayaquil. Had we touched that fever-infected port, we would have had much trouble in the Peruvian ports. Now we have our clean bill of health from Panama." It was beautiful optimism. I took another look at the reeking hospital between decks and wondered if we could ever get into any port, and as I turned away, 2 wretched, tottering skeletons passed on their way to the open cargo port. They were convalescing. I hoped for the third. Sometime during the night we passed over to the Peruvian coast and anchored off Paita early the next morning. 2 miles away, a white thread of slow surf broke on a thin line of blazing yellow beach. Beyond rose a low range of brown and yellow bluffs, the hot and arid fringe of the long desert that edges the west coast of South America. Back from the edge of surf sprattled a shabby, sand-blown, flea-bitten town, with only here and there a patch of gay red-tiled roof, nowhere a strip of green or frond of palm to relieve the arid deadliness of the brown and yellow hills. Offshore, there was neither bay nor bight in the even line of surf. A deserted brigantine at anchor dipped slowly with the long Pacific swells, its yards and decks whited like a leper from the unmolested frigate birds and seafowl that made it home. Beyond, here and there, a patched sail of no particular size or shape was barely filled by the lightest of breezes. Occasionally, as one crept past, the outfit developed into a raft on the after part of which was a rough platform of palm, on which there were housed the Indian fisherman and his crew or family. A few abandoned square tins, the well-known export tins of Rockefeller, held the drinking water, an earthen pot their food, and on this flimsy contraption they would put out miles to sea. In beating to windward, a loose board or piece from a packing case is poked through the crevices to act as centerboard. Slowly creeping over the ground swells was the port officer's boat. It had a uniformed crew and rowed well. The Peruvians watched it contentedly. Por Dios! No such stupid work here as in that Guayas River. Buenos dias, Señor Comandante. Buenos dias, Señor Doctor. And they stood aside as the captain led the way into his quarters, the procession closing with the nervous ship's surgeon and a steward with a bottle of warm champagne, for there was no more ice. Presently they emerged, amiably, and the port officers put back to shore. We would be incommunicado until that very afternoon, and then we would hear. The little boats that had clustered around the Mapocho with Panama hats, fruits, and suspicious-looking native candy were waved ashore in a cloud of disappointment. In the afternoon back came the boat, and the young surgeon prepared to meet them ceremoniously at the foot of the companion ladder. He could have spared himself the trouble. The little boat stopped 50 feet off while the port doctor handed out a judgment of 5 days quarantine. $12.50 a head for the first cabin, and $1.25 gold for the steerage, and all additional. Going into quarantine was not, from a purely business standpoint, without its profits. And also, the Ecuadorians and the Peruvians once more met with a common bond of sympathy. A barefooted Chileno sailor who had been all ready to haul down the big yellow pest flag at the foremast belayed the halyards permanently to the bridge-pin rail and trotted off to help in putting over a small boat. This boat, flying a small yellow flag, was anchored a half-mile away, and during the days of quarantine was the only means of communication with the shore. Each morning, through the medium of this anchored boat, we did the ship's business with the shore, and from it the steward would return with watermelon, eggs, turkeys, ducks, and vegetables, and quinine for the doctor. Occasionally, from day to day, the port doctor, the port captain, or a member of the sanitary junta would be rowed out in the official boat to look us over, and the tottering wrecks between the decks would be mustered at an open cargo port for a distant and skeptical inspection. The local steamship agents, through the daily messages in the anchored boat, kept us interested with the daily rumors. We were a plague ship, a floating charnel house plying our way shamelessly from port to port, a leper in the high seas shunned even by Guayaquil, and one vague and indefinite that seemed to suggest that a port official contemplated a sea trip in a week or so, and was engineering this means of giving us the pleasure of his company when he was ready. It was interesting. End of chapter 2. Read by James T. Oligny.